The sun was setting on a quiet Thursday evening in Springfield, casting long shadows across the tree-lined streets of the suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson, a well-respected elementary school teacher with 15 years of experience, was driving home from a parent-teacher conference. Her silver Honda Civic moved steadily along Mason Street, just like any other day. She'd made this drive hundreds of times before, but today would be different. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. With a heavy sigh, she checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Still, she did what any law-abiding citizen would do. She turned on her right signal, pulled over to the curb, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Barrett approached her vehicle, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Even before he reached her window, something felt off. His body language was tense, aggressive, nothing like the professional demeanor she'd experienced in previous interactions with local law enforcement. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. Mrs. Thompson noticed he hadn't stated why she'd been pulled over, which struck her as odd. She'd attended enough community meetings to know her rights, but she also knew the importance of staying calm in these situations. "Of course, officer," she replied politely, keeping her hands visible. "But may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any traffic laws." That's when things took a turn. Officer Barrett's face reddened, his jaw clenching visibly. "You don't get to ask the questions here," he snapped, his voice rising with each word. "Just do what you're told." Mrs. Thompson remained composed, though her heart was racing. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I have a right to know why I've been stopped. I'm simply asking for—" The next few seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officer Barrett's right hand shot through the open window, striking Mrs. Thompson across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound of the impact echoed through the quiet street, followed by a moment of shocked silence. What Officer Barrett didn't notice, in his moment of unchecked rage, was the small dashboard camera Mrs. Thompson had installed just months earlier after hearing stories of similar incidents at her church. The tiny red light blinked steadily, capturing everything. He also failed to notice his own body camera was recording, documenting his actions from another angle. Mrs. Thompson touched her cheek where a red mark was already forming. Despite the shock and pain, her mind was racing, thinking about what to do next. She'd attended enough Know Your Rights workshops to understand the importance of documentation. Without making any sudden movements, she noted the time on her car's digital clock, 6:42 p.m. Neighbors had begun to peer out of their windows, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen from across the street had stepped onto her porch, phone in hand, clearly recording the scene. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired veteran who lived next door, was already walking toward his car, likely preparing to serve as a witness if needed. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Officer Barrett seemed to suddenly realize he was being watched from multiple angles. His aggressive stance faltered slightly as he glanced around, noticing the growing number of witnesses. The hand that had just struck Mrs. Thompson now moved uncertainly toward his belt, as if unsure what to do next. Mrs. Thompson, despite her racing heart and stinging cheek, maintained her composure. She'd spent years teaching her students about dignity in the face of adversity, and now she was living those lessons. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her phone, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "I want to inform you that I'm going to make a phone call. I have the right to contact both the police department and my legal representation. Everything that just happened has been recorded." The color drained from Officer Barrett's face as the reality of his actions began to sink in. He'd let his temper get the better of him, and this time there would be consequences. His body camera was still recording, witnesses were watching, and he'd just struck a respected member of the community who knew her rights. The next phone call Mrs. Thompson made would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the Springfield Police Department to its core. But in that moment, as she dialed the number she'd hoped she'd never need to use, she wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. She was thinking about her students, about the example she needed to set, and about how this incident could either perpetuate a cycle of injustice or become a catalyst for change. Little did Officer Barrett know, but the person Mrs. Thompson was calling wasn't just any lawyer, it was her son, one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the state. As she waited for him to answer, she couldn't help but notice how Officer Barrett's arrogant demeanor had already begun to crack, showing the first signs of what would soon become desperate pleas for mercy. Within minutes of Mrs. Thompson's call, the quiet street transformed into a hub of activity. Her cheek still stung from the officer's strike, but her hands were steady as she used her phone to save backup copies of both her dashboard camera footage and photos of her injury. Years of teaching had taught her the importance of documentation, a lesson she often shared with her students about responsibility and accountability. Officer Barrett stood by his patrol car, repeatedly running his hands through his hair. A man who was beginning to realize the gravity of his actions. His radio crackled with activity as dispatch responded to multiple calls from concerned neighbors. Mrs. Chen was still recording from her porch, while Mr. Rodriguez had positioned himself closer to Mrs. Thompson's car, a silent guardian ensuring no further incidents would occur. Internal Affairs has been notified. Mrs. Thompson spoke clearly into her phone, her son's voice on the other end calm but filled with controlled anger. Yes, I'm safe. There are witnesses. No, don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. The next hour unfolded like a well-orchestrated play. 2 additional patrol cars arrived, their lights casting alternating patterns of red and blue across the neighboring houses. The new officers, both veterans with over 20 years of experience, approached the scene with the professionalism that Officer Barrett had failed to show. Lieutenant Wilson, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, took charge of the situation. She separated Officer Barrett from the scene, ordering him to wait in his patrol car while she spoke with Mrs. Thompson. The contrast between their interactions was stark. Where Barrett had been aggressive and confrontational, Wilson was respectful and thorough. "Ma'am, I want you to know we're taking this very seriously," Lieutenant Wilson said, her notebook open as she took detailed notes. "We've already contacted Internal Affairs, and they're on their way. Would you like medical attention for your injury?" Mrs. Thompson touched her cheek again, feeling the warmth of the developing bruise. "I think that would be wise," she replied, her teacher's instinct kicking in. "Documentation is important, isn't it?" The ambulance arrived without sirens, but its presence drew even more attention. Neighbors who had been watching from behind curtains now stepped outside, forming small groups on their lawns. The community was bearing witness, and their presence sent a clear message. This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. Inside the ambulance, a paramedic named Lee carefully photographed and documented Mrs. Thompson's injury. "I've seen too many of these," he muttered, gentle hands applying a cold pack to reduce swelling. "But not many victims are as composed as you are." "I'm not a victim," Mrs. Thompson corrected him firmly. "I'm a witness to misconduct, and I'm going to make sure it's addressed properly." Back outside, Internal Affairs investigators had arrived. 2 plainclothes officers, their badges hanging from chains around their necks, approached Mrs. Thompson with professional courtesy. They'd already viewed the body camera footage remotely, a new department policy that prevented footage from being lost or corrupted. "Your dashboard camera footage would be very helpful to our investigation," one investigator said, her tone respectful. "We can provide you with a secure copy for your records as well." Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed again. Her son had sent a message. He was 20 minutes away and had already filed emergency motions with the court. The legal machinery was moving at unprecedented speed, powered by years of his experience fighting similar cases. Officer Barrett, still sitting in his patrol car, was now speaking with his union representative on the phone. His face had lost its angry red color, replaced by a sickly pallor as the reality of his situation became clearer with each passing minute. Through the patrol car's window, he could see the growing number of witnesses, the Internal Affairs investigators, and the medical personnel documenting everything. The neighborhood had become an impromptu gathering place. Mr. Rodriguez had brought out chairs for some of the elderly witnesses who wanted to ensure their statements were taken. Mrs. Chen had shared her video footage with both Internal Affairs and Mrs. Thompson's email. Even teenagers from down the block were there, their phones broadcasting the scene to social media platforms where the incident was already gaining attention. Lieutenant Wilson approached Mrs. Thompson again, her face grave. "Your son just called the station directly," she informed her. "The chief is personally reviewing the footage right now." Officer Barrett will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her teacher's mind already thinking about how this incident could become a lesson for her students about standing up for what's right, about the power of community, and about how preparation and knowledge of one's rights could make all the difference. As the sun set completely and streetlights flickered on, the scene had transformed from a routine traffic stop into ground zero for what would become a landmark case in police accountability. Mrs. Thompson's phone continued to buzz with messages of support from colleagues, church members, and parents of her students who had heard about the incident. In his patrol car, Officer Barrett was now hunched over, his head in his hands. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Thompson speaking calmly with investigators, her dignity intact despite his actions. The reality was sinking in. He had assaulted an unarmed, respected community member, and this time, there would be no explaining it away. The sound of another car approaching drew everyone's attention. A black sedan pulled up, and Mrs. Thompson's son stepped out, briefcase in hand. His presence seemed to change the very air of the scene. Officer Barrett's union representative, who had arrived moments earlier, visibly stiffened. The next few hours would change everything, not just for Officer Barrett and Mrs. Thompson, but for the entire Springfield Police Department. As Mrs. Thompson's son walked toward her, his expression both professional and protective, Officer Barrett finally understood what true accountability felt like. His pleas for mercy hadn't even begun, but already he knew they would fall on deaf ears. The police station buzzed with unusual energy as Mrs. Thompson's son walked through the front doors. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a simple dark suit and carrying a well-worn leather briefcase, but his reputation entered the room before he did. Officers who normally lounged around the front desk suddenly found paperwork that needed their attention. Others mysteriously discovered urgent calls they had to make. He didn't announce himself or make a scene. He didn't need to. 15 years of fighting police misconduct cases had taught him that quiet confidence spoke louder than any shout could. The desk sergeant, a veteran of 20 years, recognized him immediately from previous cases that had made headlines. "I'm here to see the chief," he said simply, placing his business card on the desk. The sergeant didn't even bother calling up. He just nodded and pressed the buzzer to unlock the security door. As Mrs. Thompson's son walked through the station, young officers whispered to each other. One rookie asked his training officer, "Is that really him?" The same guy who got the River City Police Department to completely restructure last year. "Yeah, that's him," the training officer replied, keeping his voice low. "He's never lost a police misconduct case. Not one." The chief's office was on the third floor, past rows of desks and bulletin boards covered with wanted posters and department memos. He could feel eyes following him, some curious, some worried, some outright hostile. It didn't bother him. He'd walked through countless police stations just like this one, carrying similar evidence in his briefcase. The chief's secretary didn't make him wait, another sign that his reputation preceded him. Inside the office, Chief Richardson sat behind his desk, already looking tired despite it being early evening. Two internal affairs investigators stood to one side, and Officer Barrett sat in a chair, still in uniform, but without his badge and gun, which had been taken as part of standard procedure. "Thank you for coming," the chief said, gesturing to an empty chair. The formality felt strange. They both knew this wasn't a social call. Mrs. Thompson's son placed his briefcase on the desk and clicked it open. He didn't sit down. Instead, he pulled out a tablet and some papers. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I want to make sure everyone understands what we're looking at here." He turned on the tablet and played the dashboard camera footage. The sound of the slap echoed in the quiet office. Officer Barrett flinched visibly. Then came the body camera footage showing the incident from another angle. Finally, he showed the video from Mrs. Chen across the street. 3 different camera angles, he said, laying out photographs of his mother's injury. 12 witness statements already collected, medical documentation of the assault, and a history of similar complaints against Officer Barrett that were mysteriously dismissed over the past 5 years. The chief's eyebrows rose at the last part. Mrs. Thompson's son pulled out more papers, copies of old complaints that the department thought had been buried in the system. Officer Barrett's face grew paler with each document that landed on the desk. "How did you get those?" the chief asked, genuinely surprised. I have friends in the records department of every police station within 100 miles, he replied simply. When an officer has a pattern of behavior, word gets around. People keep copies, people remember. Officer Barrett started to speak. Look, I know I messed up, but... Officer Barrett, Mrs. Thompson's son, cut him off firmly but professionally. I advise you not to say another word without your union representative present. Though I should warn you, the union's lawyer is an old classmate of mine. He's already reviewed the footage and told me they won't be offering much support in this case. The color drained from Barrett's face completely. The chief leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. What do you want? What do I want? Mrs. Thompson's son repeated the question thoughtfully. I want police officers to protect and serve their communities. I want them to treat every citizen with the respect they deserve. I want accountability when they fail to do so. He pulled out one final document from his briefcase. This is a detailed proposal for department-wide reforms. Body cameras that can't be turned off during interactions with the public. Mandatory de-escalation training. His civilian oversight board with real power. And yes, Officer Barrett's immediate termination. Officer Barrett jumped to his feet. You can't do this. I have a family to support. Mrs. Thompson's son turned to him, his expression firm but not unkind. So does every person you've mistreated over the years. The difference is, they didn't choose to abuse their power. You did. The chief picked up the proposal, flipping through its pages. This is extensive. It's necessary, Mrs. Thompson's son replied. And it's just the beginning. Either we do this the easy way, with the department's full cooperation and a commitment to real change, or we do it the hard way, with a very public lawsuit, media coverage, and the kind of scrutiny that ends careers not just of officers, but of police chiefs who protected them. The room fell silent. Officer Barrett slumped back in his chair, all his previous arrogance gone. The internal affairs investigators exchanged glances, knowing they were witnessing a turning point in their department's history. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, Mrs. Thompson's son said, closing his briefcase. I should warn you, 3 news stations have already reached out to me about this incident. They're waiting for my call. As he turned to leave, Officer Barrett finally broke. Please, he said, his voice cracking. I'm begging you. We can work something out. Mrs. Thompson's son paused at the door. Officer Barrett, my mother is an elementary school teacher. Every day, she teaches children about respect, responsibility, and facing the consequences of their actions. The time for working something out was before you decided to abuse your authority. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and a department on the brink of major change. As he headed back to his car, officers scrambled to get out of his way. They all knew that tomorrow would bring either the biggest police reform their city had ever seen or the biggest scandal in their department's history. The next morning arrived with the kind of tension you could feel in the air. The chief's office, usually quiet at 8 a.m., was already full. Coffee cups sat untouched on the conference table as everyone waited. Officer Barrett had arrived early, wearing a civilian suit instead of his uniform, looking like he hadn't slept all night. His union representative sat next to him, reviewing papers with a grim expression. The chief had spent most of the night reading through the reform proposal and making phone calls to city officials. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of a sleepless night spent weighing options and consequences. The department's lawyer sat in the corner, his usual confidence notably absent. When Mrs. Thompson's son arrived, he wasn't alone. His mother walked in with him, head held high, the bruise on her cheek now a visible reminder of what had brought them all here. Officer Barrett couldn't meet her eyes. The room fell silent as they took their seats. Before we begin, the chief said, clearing his throat, I want to apologize personally to you, Mrs. Thompson. What happened yesterday goes against everything we're supposed to stand for. Mrs. Thompson nodded but didn't speak. Her son opened his briefcase and pulled out an updated version of the reform proposal. Have you had time to review the original document? We have, the chief replied, and we've made some calls. The mayor and city council have been briefed on the situation. He paused, glancing at Officer Barrett. They've authorized me to negotiate terms. The next 2 hours were intense but professional. They went through the proposal point by point, body camera policies, training requirements, civilian oversight. Each item was discussed, debated, and either accepted or modified. Officer Barrett sat silently through most of it, watching his career crumble in real time. Finally, they reached the section about his termination. That's when he couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "I know I was wrong. I lost my temper. But I've got 18 years on the force. I've got a pension, a family. There must be something else we can do." Mrs. Thompson's son was about to respond, but his mother raised her hand. Everyone fell silent as she spoke for the first time that morning. "Officer Barrett," she said, her voice firm but not cruel, "yesterday you pulled me over for no reason. When I asked about it, which was my right, you struck me. Do you know what I thought about in that moment?" Barrett shook his head, unable to speak. "I thought about my students. Every day, I teach them about respect, about right and wrong, about taking responsibility for their actions. What would they think if they knew their teacher had been hit by a police officer? What lesson would they learn if that officer faced no consequences?" The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Mrs. Thompson touched her bruised cheek gently. "You're worried about your pension, your family. I understand that. But yesterday, you weren't worried about my family, my safety, or my rights as a citizen. You thought your badge gave you the power to do whatever you wanted. That's exactly why you can't keep it." Officer Barrett slumped in his chair, tears forming in his eyes. His union representative placed a hand on his shoulder, but there was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, and the videos clear. The chief picked up a pen and signed the termination papers. "Effective immediately," he said quietly. Officer Barrett's badge and gun, which had been sitting on the conference table, were placed in an evidence bag. His access cards were deactivated. 18 years of service ended with a few signatures. But the meeting wasn't over. Mrs. Thompson's son turned to the broader reforms. "This incident is a symptom of a larger problem," he said, addressing the room. "These changes aren't just about one officer or one incident. They're about making sure this never happens to anyone else." The chief nodded, signing the reform proposals one by one. New training programs would be implemented within 30 days. Body camera policies would be overhauled immediately. A civilian oversight board would be established within 6 months. Each signature represented a small but significant change in how the department would operate. As the meeting wound down, Officer Barrett made one last attempt to save something of his career. "What about a desk job? Something away from the public?" Mrs. Thompson's son shook his head. "The department's insurance won't cover you anymore. Not after this. Your law enforcement career is over." Barrett broke down then, years of authority and arrogance crumbling away. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, looking at Mrs. Thompson. "I'm so sorry." Mrs. Thompson stood up, gathering her belongings. "I hope you use this as a chance to learn and grow," she said. "That's what I tell my students when they make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't in never failing, but in how they handle their failures." As they left the office, reporters were already gathering outside the police station. The story would break by noon. By evening, it would be national news, not just because of what had happened, but because of the reforms that came from it. Officer Barrett walked out a different door, no longer a police officer, just a man who had let power corrupt him and was now facing the consequences. His last view of the station was of Mrs. Thompson and her son standing together, strong and dignified, as they prepared to announce the changes that would reshape the department. The morning sun was bright, marking the start of a new day and, hopefully, a new era in police accountability. The story exploded across social media faster than anyone expected. By lunchtime, video clips of the incident were trending nationwide. Local news vans lined up outside the police station, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. But what made this story different from other police misconduct cases wasn't the incident itself, it was what happened next. Mrs. Thompson's son stood at the podium, microphones clustered in front of him like metal flowers. Camera lights turned the cloudy day bright as sunshine. Behind him, his mother stood with community leaders, religious figures, and city council members. The crowd of reporters fell silent as he began to speak. What happened yesterday was not just about one officer or one incident, he began, his voice clear and steady. It's about a system that needs change, and today, we're announcing those changes. The press conference wasn't about anger or revenge. Instead, Mrs. Thompson's son laid out the reform package point by point. Each new policy and procedure was explained in simple terms that everyone could understand. Reporters' pens scratched across notepads as he spoke about mandatory de-escalation training, new body camera rules, and the Civilian Oversight Board. But perhaps most importantly, he said, gesturing to the group behind him, we're announcing the creation of the Community Police Partnership Council. This council will include teachers, social workers, mental health professionals, and community leaders who will work directly with the police department to rebuild trust and ensure accountability. In the crowd, Mr. Rodriguez from next door stood with other neighborhood residents. Mrs. Chen was there too, her phone still recording, but this time she was capturing history being made instead of misconduct being committed. The community had come together not just to demand justice, but to be part of the solution. Inside the police station, officers gathered around break room televisions, watching the press conference with mixed emotions. Some were angry, feeling like they were all being punished for one officer's mistake. Others saw the opportunity for positive change. The younger officers, especially, seemed eager for the new training and clearer guidelines. Lieutenant Wilson, who had handled the initial response to the incident, addressed her shift during roll call. "This isn't about pointing fingers," she said, her voice firm but encouraging. "This is about being better, about serving our community the way we swore to do when we took our oaths." Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Thompson returned to her classroom. Her students, all 10 and 11 years old, had heard about what happened. Kids that age pick up on everything, even when adults think they're not listening. She decided to turn it into a teaching moment. "Sometimes bad things happen," she told her class, touching her healing cheek gently. "But what matters is how we respond to them. Do we get angry and want revenge? Or do we work to make things better?" One little girl raised her hand. "My mom says you're really brave, Mrs. Thompson." "Brave doesn't mean not being scared," she replied. "It means doing the right thing even when you are scared." Back at the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson's son was meeting with the district attorney. The reforms at the police department were just the beginning. They were reviewing every case Officer Barrett had been involved with over the past 5 years, looking for patterns of misconduct that might have been missed or ignored. The former officer's personnel file lay open on the desk, revealing previous complaints that had been swept under the rug. Each complaint represented someone who hadn't had the resources or knowledge to fight back. Mrs. Thompson's son made a note to reach out to each of them. Justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. City council members, sensing the public mood, fast-tracked funding for the new training programs. The police union, usually resistant to change, found itself unable to block the reforms in the face of overwhelming public support and irrefutable evidence. Sometimes the right moment and the right case could shift the ground beneath everyone's feet. Local businesses started putting up signs supporting the reforms. Community First posters appeared in shop windows. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about successful police reform in other cities, showing that change was possible when everyone worked together. The changes weren't just on paper. Officers started attending community meetings, not in uniform but in civilian clothes, listening to residents' concerns and experiences. Some were uncomfortable at first, but as the conversations continued, barriers began to break down on both sides. Mrs. Thompson's classroom became an unofficial hub for discussion about citizenship and civic responsibility. Other teachers asked her to speak to their classes about standing up for what's right. Parents requested special meetings to talk about how to teach their children about interacting with law enforcement. "It's not about teaching our kids to be afraid," she would explain. "It's about teaching them to be informed, to be respectful, and to know their rights. And it's about teaching them that when something is wrong, they have the power to help make it right." The story caught the attention of civil rights organizations across the country. Mrs. Thompson's son found himself fielding calls from other cities wanting to know how they could implement similar reforms. He began preparing a handbook that could help other communities create their own change. Even some retired police officers stepped forward to support the reforms. They shared stories of how they'd seen the culture of policing change over their careers, not always for the better, and how these new policies could help restore the trust they'd once worked so hard to build. As weeks passed, the bruise on Mrs. Thompson's cheek faded, but the impact of what happened only grew stronger. The incident that could have torn the community apart instead became the catalyst for bringing it together. Real change was happening, not through shouting and anger, but through steady, determined work and cooperation. 1 month after the incident, Mrs. Thompson stood before the first meeting of the Community Police Partnership Council. Looking out at the faces of police officers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens all ready to work together, she smiled. This was how real change happened, not through force, but through understanding, not through revenge, but through reform. "We're not here to dwell on the past," she told the gathered crowd. "We're here to build a better future, and we're going to do it together." 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The maple trees along Mason Street were changing colors, their leaves painting the neighborhood in warm oranges and reds. The spot where Mrs. Thompson had been pulled over now looked no different from any other stretch of road, but the changes that had started there had spread far beyond the pavement and street signs. The police department had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. Every patrol car now had a small sign on its bumper reading, "Protecting with Respect," a reminder to both officers and citizens about the department's new commitment. Body cameras had become such a normal part of the uniform that officers felt uncomfortable without them, like forgetting to wear their badges. The former Officer Barrett had moved to another state, looking for a fresh start. His final letter of apology sat framed in Mrs. Thompson's classroom, not as a trophy but as a teaching tool. Sometimes, she would tell her students, the biggest lessons come from the hardest moments. One crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Thompson's son stood before a packed city council chamber. The room buzzed with energy as he prepared to present the 6-month progress report on the reforms. Charts and graphs showed dramatic improvements in community relations. Complaint numbers had dropped by 60%. More importantly, positive interactions between police and citizens had increased significantly. "When we started this journey," he began, adjusting his tie, "some people said these changes would make our community less safe. They said officers wouldn't be able to do their jobs effectively. They said it was just another case of overreaction to a single incident." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Today, I'm happy to report that not only have crime rates remained stable, but citizen cooperation with police has increased by 40%. When people trust law enforcement, they're more willing to work with them to keep their communities safe." In the audience, several police officers nodded in agreement. Lieutenant Wilson, recently promoted to captain, sat in her dress uniform, a small smile playing at her lips. The changes hadn't been easy, but they had made her job better, not harder. The new Civilian Oversight Board had reviewed over 200 past cases, identifying patterns that needed addressing and recommending additional training where needed. But they'd also highlighted outstanding police work, creating a monthly award for officers who showed exceptional community engagement and de-escalation skills. Back in her classroom, Mrs. Thompson had turned the experience into a year-long civics project. Her students had created a Know Your Rights comic book that was now being distributed to schools across the district. The artwork might have been simple, but the message was clear and powerful. "My dad's a police officer," one of her students said during a class discussion. "He says things are different now. Better. He doesn't feel like people are afraid of him anymore." The Community Police Partnership Council had become a model for other cities. Delegations from across the country came to observe their meetings and learn from their success. Mrs. Thompson's son found himself traveling to speak at law enforcement conferences, sharing how one incident had sparked a peaceful revolution in police-community relations. Local businesses had gotten involved too. The coffee shop next to the police station now offered a community bridge builder discount. Anyone who came in with both a police officer and a community member got their order free. It was a small thing, but it encouraged conversation and connection. The department's new training programs had expanded beyond just de-escalation. Officers now received regular education on community history, cultural awareness, and mental health response. The trainers included local residents who shared their experiences and perspectives, turning abstract concepts into real human connections. One day, Mrs. Thompson received a letter from the former Officer Barrett's daughter. "My dad's different now," she wrote. "He's working as a youth counselor, helping kids stay out of trouble. He says you taught him the hardest and most important lesson of his life. The media attention had mostly faded, but the work continued. The reforms had taken root and grown into something sustainable. Other departments started adopting what became known as the Thompson model of police reform, named not after the lawyer who crafted it, but after the teacher who inspired it. At a community picnic in the park, kids played basketball with police officers while parents chatted nearby. Nobody flinched when a patrol car drove past. The officers waved, and people waved back. Trust was growing, one interaction at a time. Mrs. Thompson watched it all from her favorite bench, grading papers in the autumn sunshine. A rookie officer approached, looking nervous. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm new to the force," she said. "They tell your story during training now. I just wanted to say thank you. You changed how we do our jobs, but more importantly, you changed how we think about our jobs." The bruise had long since faded, but its impact remained, not as a mark of violence, but as a catalyst for change. The incident that could have divided the community had instead united it. The moment that could have sparked anger had instead inspired reform. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across streets that felt safer and more connected than ever before, Mrs. Thompson smiled. She thought about all the lessons she'd taught over the years, but perhaps the most important one had come from her own experience. Real change doesn't always come from grand gestures or angry demands, but from steady determination, wisdom, and the courage to turn a negative moment into a positive movement. The story wasn't over. Real change never is. But the foundation had been laid for something lasting, something that would continue to grow and evolve long after the original incident had faded from memory. That was the true victory, not just fixing what was broken, but building something better in its place.